Last week I released a video of 10 must-know tips for your Fujifilm camera for beginners, and today's video, it's time for part 2. Last week we learned how to turn your camera into auto mode. Now let's talk about the different other modes that you can achieve on your Fujifilm camera as well. First, aperture priority. Aperture priority is basically when you let your camera control your shutter speed as well as your ISO, but take control over the aperture of your lens. Now, if you want to put your Fujifilm camera in aperture priority mode, all that you have to do is to put your ISO dial into auto, your shutter speed dial into auto, and then you just have to turn your aperture dial on your lens. And by doing that, your Fujifilm camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed and the ISO, and you will control your aperture only. Next, if you want to put it in shutter priority, meaning that you only want to control the shutter speed of the camera, well, this time you are going to put your aperture dial into auto, your ISO dial into auto, and you will only control your shutter speed dial. And finally, if you want to put it in program mode, meaning that the ISO is the only thing that you will control, then put your aperture dial into auto, your shutter speed dial into auto, and finally, you will change your ISO dial to be able to control the ISO value that you want to put. Okay, so let's say you are in one of those automatic or semi-automatic mode, meaning that at least one of the positions of your dials or your ring here is in the A mode. You can use this particular dial right here called the exposure compensation dial to either brighten or darken your image. Basically, by using A, you let your camera decide what is the correct exposure for your image. However, if you feel like you would like to have darker shadows or brighter highlights, then you can just turn to overexpose your image towards the plus or towards the minus to underexpose your image. And that way your camera will automatically adjust the values of, let's say, if you're in aperture mode priority and you want to control your aperture, but you want the camera to decide the ISO and the shutter speed, then by doing minus, your camera will increase the shutter speed or decrease the ISO, and by doing plus, it will either decrease the shutter speed or increase the ISO. So now you know how to use aperture priority, shutter speed priority, or program mode. But what does the aperture do exactly? Well, the aperture is the opening of your lens and will basically change the depth of field of your image. With a wide aperture, meaning a small f number, you will have that shallow depth of field. However, with a small aperture, meaning a big f number, you will pretty much be able to see everything in focus in your image. So if you're taking a portrait and you want to have a blurry background, what should you do? Wide aperture, right? And if you want to take, let's say, a landscape picture and want to have the whole landscape in focus, then what should you do? Correct, you should close your aperture with a bigger f number. And I know that it can be a little bit counterintuitive because the bigger the f, the smaller the aperture, but just remember it and eventually you will get a hang of it. Next, shutter speed. What is exactly the shutter speed? The shutter speed is basically the speed at which your shutter will close when taking a picture. And as a good rule of thumb, you want your shutter speed to be twice your focal length in 35mm equivalent to make sure that you do not have any blur when you take a picture with micro movements. Let's say, for example, that right now I'm using the 33mm f1.4 on my Fujifilm camera, equivalent 50mm on a 35mm sensor. Then I would put my shutter speed at 1/100 of a second to avoid micro movement when I'm taking the picture. But that's not the only thing to consider when it comes to shutter speed. You also have to consider the speed of your subject. And the faster your subject, the faster your shutter speed has to be in order for you to have a clear, clean, sharp picture. Let's say, for example, that you use a 16mm f1.4, which is an equivalent of a 24mm or so. So you set your shutter speed to 48 because it's twice the focal that you're using, but you're trying to photograph a bird that is flying around, you will never catch the bird in a very clear and sharp picture because the bird is moving way too fast. And the way you know which shutter speed to use is pretty much through trial and error. Typically, if you want to photograph people that are walking around, typically I would set it to at least 1/250th of a second. People running around would be 1/500 of a second. Animals, I like to set it at least at 1/1000 of a second. And then I adjust my shutter speed for even faster moving subjects. Alright, and finally, let's talk about ISO. ISO is basically a digital gain that is applied onto the data that reaches your sensor to basically boost the amount of light that it receives. So let's say that you are in the dark and you're trying to take pictures out there, and even if you open your aperture to the maximum value, meaning to the minimal f value, so for this lens f1.4, that you decrease your shutter speed to the minimum value for you to have a sharp picture, but you still don't have enough light, well, you can raise your ISO, let's say to 1600, 3200 or other values until you get a clear, properly exposed picture. However, you want to make sure that you do not go hardcore too much on the ISO, because the higher the ISO, the more noise and grain it will introduce in your picture. And as a good rule of thumb, remember that the ISO is the value that you want to minimize always. But you have to make sure that the aperture and the shutter speed are set so that you can create the picture that you want to create. And then you can just compensate with the ISO. This lens right here is a native Fujifilm lens and has some communication, pins to be able to communicate with the camera. However, if you have a lens that do not have that, then you might not be able straight out of the box to take pictures with it on your Fujifilm camera. And here is why. You have to go in your menu into setting, then you have to go all the way down to button and dial setting, and you will see shoot without lens on the second page, and by default this option is off. You have to turn it on for you to be able to shoot with a manual lens on your Fujifilm camera. And while we are here, let's talk about another, I think, very important tips on your Fujifilm camera, which could save your life, honestly, on jobs, or if you are on a travel and you want to take amazing memories, but don't realize that there is no SD card in your camera. By default, on your Fujifilm camera, you are able to take pictures without SD card or CF Express or any media inside of it. The media will just appear as if you were taking a picture. You will be able to hear your shutter shoot properly, but the picture will not be saved anywhere somehow. So imagine if you go somewhere, you take pictures and you forgot to put an SD card in there, you just wasted basically the whole day worth of pictures and you cannot do anything about it. So here is how you can avoid that. In your menu, go into the setup, again, button and dial setting, go down to the second page, and then in the shoot without card option, turn this option off. And that way, whenever you do not have a card in your camera, like it is my case right now, if I try to shoot right now, I will just get a message, no memory card in the camera. And that way I'm sure that I cannot, by mistake, try to take pictures without having an SD card in there. Whenever I take a picture, I don't know about you, but I really enjoy having the image being displayed directly on my screen right after taking it. And it's very simple to do this on your Fujifilm camera. Go to Menu, Screen Setup, and then go to Image Display. I typically like to set it up for 0.5 seconds so that the image is easily displayed right after I take the shot and doesn't stay here for too long. But for me, 0.5 seconds is the sweet spot where it doesn't stay here too long and I still have the time to just have a glance at it. Alright, that's it for today's video with 10 more tips for your Fujifilm camera. Let me know down in the comments if you have any tips that you want to share with the people that are starting their Fujifilm journey. And if you want to have a part 3 of this video, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe because there are more videos coming. I'll see you in the next one.